One of the challenges with writing your infrastructure as code is that sometimes you need to use values that are not actually known at the time you're writing your code. A typical example would be something like the unique ID for some resource. Usually, these unique IDs will be given to the resource by the cloud provider when you actually deploy it. So when you haven't deployed it and you're still just defining your infrastructure in your code, how can you use that value if it's not yet known? In this video, I'm going to show you how Pulumi solves this with its concept of outputs. And I'm going to use this really simple demonstration stack where I'm creating a Cognito user pool and a user pool client. If you're not familiar with Cognito, don't worry about that. This is purely just an illustration. It doesn't matter what the resources are because the concepts are the same. But just to give some context, Cognito is AWS's cloud-based authentication service. So you can use Cognito if you want to allow users to register themselves with your application and then sign in. And the way that you do that with Cognito is that you create something called a user pool. So a user pool is basically a representation of your user database. And you also create a user pool client, and that represents some application, like perhaps a website, that is going to be using the user pool. So that's what you can see on these lines here. You can see that on this line, I'm defining a user pool, and I've just left the input arguments as the defaults here. And then on the next line, you can see that I've made a user pool client, and I've tried leaving the arguments as the default, but you can see that VS Code isn't happy, and that's because we actually have to provide an argument called user pool ID. In other words, we have to give the user pool client the ID of the user pool that it's connected to, which makes sense. Each of these user pool clients is connected to a specific user pool. So somehow we need to get the ID of this pool into this client. So again, this represents a bit of a technical challenge because we don't actually know what the user pool ID is going to be. We won't know that until it's been deployed. So what we'll see is that Pulumi solves this by wrapping the possible outputs from a resource in a class called output. We can see this if we have a look at some of the attributes of our user pool. You can see that there is an ID field, and if we look at its type, you'll see that its type is not just a plain string, which is what we'd expect an ID to be. That is how Cognito actually represents its IDs, but instead its type is actually this output type, this pulumi.output, and then it just passes in the string as a type parameter. So that shows how Pulumi is saying that this thing is not actually a string, but it's something that will be a string at some point in the future. And so you can still use this object and pass it around your program as a representation of the string that will be fulfilled in the future when you deploy the stack. Some people who are used to promises or tasks and concepts like that might find this a very familiar idea. And that's because it's exactly the same thing. Behind the scenes, Pulumi does implement its outputs using promises if you're in JavaScript or TypeScript or Python, or tasks if you're in C#, or whatever the equivalent concept is in the language that you're using. But generally, we don't have to think about them in terms of promises or tasks because Pulumi is trying to provide a nice sort of simple abstracted interface. So we just think in terms of outputs. So we know that we can get a representation of the ID, even if it's not the ID itself. And unsurprisingly, of course, if we look at the user pool ID parameter and look at its type, you can see that it also does not accept just a plain string. It actually accepts a Pulumi input of type string. I'm sure it won't surprise you to learn that an input type is capable of being assigned an output. It can also be assigned actual strings as well, so it's quite flexible. If you know what the value is at this point, you can pass it in, or if you don't, you can pass in an output. The end result is something that looks very simple and intuitive. All I have to do is just pass in to the user pool ID parameter the ID of the user pool. And so it looks like I'm simply passing a string into a parameter that needed a string. But it's really useful to understand what's going on underneath because, as we'll see later in the video, dealing with these outputs can sometimes be a little bit more complex than that. And by the way, Pulumi is quite smart when we do things like this. For example, having done that, Pulumi will now understand that it must create the user pool object before it creates the client, because the client has this dependency on the pool having deployed first. And that's something that most of the time you just don't have to think about. But again, it's worth understanding what Pulumi is actually doing for you behind the scenes. So that was a nice simple example where we just wanted to take the value and pass it in somewhere else. But what if we want to do something more complex, like perhaps take a value and then modify it and pass it in as an input to another parameter? I'm going to give you a slightly contrived example. Contrived because I'm not sure it's something you would realistically need to do, but hopefully you'll see that it's just trying to keep the example nice and simple. The concept will be applicable to many different situations. What I'm going to say is I want to create a bucket whose name contains the ID of my user pool client, perhaps because I'm creating a bucket per user pool client for some reason. Let's not dwell too much on why we might want to do that, because it creates an interesting exercise for us. Specifically, I'm going to set the bucket name to be something like CloudSpeak user pool client dash, and then I want the ID of the client. And you might think, well, that's simple, surely we just do something like this, client.id. The problem is this kind of thing won't work. So this is a good opportunity to talk about exactly why this won't work. When you run a Pulumi command like Pulumi up, it'll actually run in two stages. The first stage is that it executes this program, as you can see it now, and that will create representations of all of the resources. Pulumi uses that to build up some kind of complex graph of dependencies and make sure that there's no contradictions or circular dependencies or anything like that. Then when it's ready, it will go to the next stage where it actually deploys the resources. And so because that string concatenation is going to happen during the first stage, this value, once again, will not be known. You can see that its type is output, and if you try to concatenate it to another string, it's not going to give the result that you want because we don't know what client ID is at the time that concatenation occurs. Instead, we need to have a way of deferring the code that computes the bucket name so that it won't happen until after the client ID is actually known. It'll happen later on at the deployment time. This is something we can do using the apply method that all outputs will have, and it looks like this. I'm going to move my client ID here, and I'm going to say .apply. And then, as you can see from the documentation, what I have to pass in is a function that's going to take a string as an argument, and the reason it's a string is because the actual ID will eventually be a string. So this string argument is going to represent the ID when it finally arrives. And then my function returns some new value that I've computed for that. So for example, I could say user pool client ID, and I want to map it onto this. So the difference between this and the last example is that instead of trying to compute the actual value in this code, I've instead given it a function and said, here's the function that I want you to execute when the ID is known. And so this bit of code will instead get executed in the second stage after Pulumi has deployed the user pool client and figured out what its ID is going to be. So while this solves the problem, some of you might then be wondering, well, what happens if we want to compute a value that is based on two outputs? It's not really clear how we would go about that. For example, let's suppose that I want the bucket name to include both the name of the user pool and the ID of the user pool client. It's not quite clear how we'd go about that because the syntax requires us to choose an output and then execute the apply function. So the answer is to use another function that Pulumi provides called all. In TypeScript, all lives in the Pulumi package. The syntax is slightly different for different languages, but the function will be there. The way that all works is you pass in an array of outputs, and it will then return you a single output whose value is an array of all the values of those outputs. So it's taking multiple outputs and then turning them into a single one. So, for example, the two outputs that I want to use to compute this bucket name are pool.name and client.id. So that now returns a single output, and because of our knowledge of how to use outputs, we know that we can then use the apply function on that, and we can see that TypeScript is pretty good at inferring this kind of thing. It knows that we need to give the apply function another function that takes an array of 2 strings as its input. So that's going to be the array of the 2 string values that we want, the user pool name and the client ID. And then we can just return whatever value we want from that. So I'm going to take as an argument, and I'm going to use some nice TypeScript notation to get those 2 individual values out of the array. So pool name, client ID, and then return whatever I want. So I'm just going to put cloudspeak dash pool name dash client ID. And since I haven't demonstrated any of this stuff being deployed yet, I'm going to deploy the stack just so that you can see that this has worked. And we'll see from the stack outputs that we got the bucket name we were expecting. It's, in my case, it's cloudspeak followed by the name of the user pool, which I guess was just user pool, and then the client ID. So hopefully you can see that outputs are pretty flexible, and Pulumi gives you a few tools to help you manipulate them. But one thing about this is it's a little bit ugly. And in the case specifically of string interpolation, which is what I was doing here, there is another function that Pulumi provides that makes this a little bit easier. Now, the syntax for this one does vary a bit between the different languages. So I'm going to show you the documentation. Under this section, working with outputs and strings, it'll show you an example down here of how we can either concatenate together outputs that happen to be strings, and it's basically just a shorthand for what we just did. Or we can use TypeScript's string interpolation if we want to, using the dollar bracket syntax. And the reason it's worth checking the documentation is that you'll see that for Python, for example, the interpolate version doesn't exist, but the concat one does. So I can rewrite what I just did like this: pulumi.interpolate . And you can see that this is really intuitive, and again, makes it look a little bit like we are just interpolating strings. But it's really useful to know that that's not actually what's happening. Because we're using the Pulumi interpolate function, we now understand that we're actually taking 2 outputs, and what we're producing, as you can see from the documentation, is also an output. So this final value won't actually be computed until the values are available. Remember, though, that these nice functions are only available for strings. So if you're doing anything other than string interpolation or string concatenation, then you'll need to do something more like what I just showed, where you use the all function to merge multiple outputs into one, and then the apply function to apply some processing after deployment. In the previous video, I said that I would mention secrets again, but actually I've decided to split this one up, and I'm making an additional video next that is focused on stack outputs. So these are output values that are exported from our stack and can be used by other programs or other stacks and so on. So I'll talk about secrets again there.